Manufactured Brotherhood, the NHL Locker Room Bond. The reason I'm making this video is because I've realised that there's a common underlying issue running through many of the topics around hockey culture that I've talked about before. I've previously discussed why personal relationships in hockey appear to fail at such a high rate. I've talked about the team first and don't distract the team ethos that feeds directly into why a gay NHL player might choose not to come out. Not because they necessarily expect overt homophobia from teammates or fans, but because visibility itself is framed as distraction from the collective. When I spoke about the recent Ottawa Senators scandal, I argued that the issue was not alleged infidelity. The scandal existed because there was an allegation of a breach of the locker room code of silence and loyalty to one's so-called brothers. I've also pointed out how deliberately bland and neutral most hockey media responses are. Even the genuine superstars routinely deflect attention back to the team, even when it's obvious that they are the ones driving outcomes. This video isn't a rehash of those arguments. It's the realization that all of them circle the same central relationship in a hockey player's life, the one that hockey culture repeatedly tells them should come first. When you step back and look at the discourse as a whole, the same idea keeps resurfacing. Hockey operates on a manufactured hierarchy of relationships, one that is actively produced, reinforced, and maintained by the league, its teams, and its culture. Once that hierarchy is named clearly, a lot of behaviour that people claim to find shocking actually begins to make sense. What's striking is not that the hierarchy exists, but how rarely its constructed nature is acknowledged openly by anybody. From a very young age, hockey players are taught, trained, and conditioned, I would say brainwashed, to understand that the most important relationship in their lives exists inside the locker room. Brotherhood, family, loyalty, silence. The room comes first. The message is not subtle at all. It is repeated constantly by coaches, organisations, media, and former players. The language is always consistent, battling for teammates, standing up for them, defending them at all costs. The partners and families of players are expected to understand and adapt. Sacrifice on the part of the player and their loved ones is seen as necessary, noble, and unavoidable. This doesn't mean that players don't love their partners or care about their families, but it does mean that during the season, prioritisation is structurally embedded into the profession, and everything else is subrogated to the game and the team. Games take precedence, travel takes precedence, and the room takes precedence, not as an emotional preference, but as an operational reality. Alongside all of this sits another very different language. Hockey openly talks about assets, pieces, inventory, timelines, rebuilding, retooling, and extracting value while it exists. That language is ruthlessly utilitarian. Players are discussed as components in a system. They are resources that depreciate in value over time. What's striking is not that this language exists, because every industry has a version of this, but that it sits entirely unexamined beside the very emotional and inspirational and potentially misleading language of family, brotherhood, and unconditional loyalty that borrows heavily from military language. So in terms of this manufactured brotherhood, the more I observe hockey culture, the clearer it becomes to me that the relationship that players are asked to elevate above all others is not organic in the way that it is often presented. A hockey team is not a family in any ordinary sense. It more closely resembles a cast or a touring company or an artificially assembled pop group. The faces change constantly. Players move through trades, waivers, injuries, call-ups, and cap decisions. Someone that is a brother one week can be gone the next, replaced almost immediately. But the language hasn't changed. The bond is still framed as sacred, lifelong, and unconditional. Players are asked to sacrifice for their team, sometimes in very literal ways. Although everyone keeps saying that enforcers are no longer a thing and are obsolete, it's pretty clear that the role still exists in practice. Certain players are valued for absorbing physical punishment. There are euphemisms used to describe them. They're protecting stars, or bringing energy, or bringing physicality. But really, this is just a euphemism for saying that their job is to use their body to protect another player because they are not as skillful and therefore not as valuable as that other player. Players are encouraged to organize their emotional lives around a relationship that is conditional, role-based, and largely outside their control. This is because players don't choose their teammates. Even coaches lack final authority over roster composition. The power to choose a roster sits with general managers, ownership, salary cap structures, and a long-term organizational strategy. And yet these players are expected to build trust, loyalty, and intimacy within a group whose membership is unstable and whose continuity is never guaranteed. They sacrifice for someone one night who might be replaced a couple of days later, or someone who is their brother now may be booted off the roster because they're not performing well enough. They're told to treat the group as family, while knowing that any member, including themselves, can be removed at short notice for reasons that may be unrelated to effort or commitment. The imbalance matters because although the bond may well be emotionally real for the players, the terms are externally governed. This loyalty can only last as long as usefulness, and belonging can only last as long as performance. The proximity creates intimacy, but when the proximity ends, that intimacy often dissolves as well. That doesn't mean that the bonds are insincere from the perspective of the players. It does mean that they're structurally fragile. I've seen it over and over again. The group looks really tight, but then the next day, one of the team is now an opponent, or they've been sent down to the minors, or they've retired and they're gone completely, but the team just continues. The thing that made me think about hockey in the same terms as professional wrestling or theatrical production or pop groups is not necessarily that it is fake, but because identities remain stable while the people are interchangeable. In wrestling, performers rotate in and out while characters and storylines persist. In theatre, roles remain constant even as the actors change. Hockey functions similarly, except that the personas are attached to teams rather than individuals. So teams are framed as villainous, brutal, or blue-collar, tragic, plucky, or ruthlessly efficient, depending on the narrative needs of the moment. These identities persist through massive roster turnover. The team has a personality manufactured around it, and the players slot into it. That's why I'm always quite bemused by fan reactions, because they get so angry about a particular team. But it doesn't seem to make sense to me, because a long-time franchise face can be reassigned overnight and then immediately belong to an entirely different team with a different story. Brad Marchand spent 16 seasons as a Boston Bruin. He was their captain and functioned as a defining face of that franchise. Then he was traded, and suddenly he was a Florida Panther, wearing a rival jersey, occupying a different part of the narrative. Quinn Hughes used to sit at the center of the Vancouver Canucks identity. He was the face of the franchise. But in an extremely short period of time after a blockbuster trade, he showed up in Minnesota Wild Green. In return for Hughes, Vancouver received forwards Marco Rossi and Liam Ogren and defenseman Zeev Bruin, and a first-round pick in the 2026 NHL draft. It definitely felt like a marketplace trade in which one side receives a fully baked apple pie in exchange for a series of high-end ingredients. More recently, Kiefer Sherwood moved from being one of the most critical players in the Vancouver Canucks to being a San Jose Shark, not because of his character or effort changing, but because the plan and the timeline did. Vancouver received a second-round pick in the 2026 NHL draft, a second-round pick in the 2027 NHL draft, and an undrafted defenseman named Cole Clayton. That transaction felt even more like a futures commodities trading process than anything else. One moment Sherwood was standing there after bag skates as a Canuck, and then just a few days later he was dressed from head to toe in Sharks teal. He might not even be permanently staying with the Sharks. If they can't work out a contract for him, he may well be traded before the trade deadline. All of this has exposed the mechanics beneath the mythology, because the roles persist, the jerseys persist, the storylines persist, even as individual players swap in and out. It's not a structure that's built for permanence. It is a very manufactured environment that is organized around continuity of narrative and performance rather than enduring personal bonds. And yet the players are brainwashed into thinking that this is the most important relationship of their lives. Every time I listen to the language of the way hockey teams and hockey players are described, I definitely feel a sense of cognitive dissonance. The emotional language of hockey motivates sacrifice. The operational language manages bodies. The league moves between them seamlessly. I can hear the media talking about rebuilding, retooling, and managing assets, clearing space, The players are inventory. They're valuable while they're productive, they're movable when they're not, and they're replaceable when the timeline shifts. Even when they are valuable, sometimes they don't stay because they can be used to extract value by swapping them for something else. On one level, the players do seem to understand this. That's why during media, you'll frequently hear them saying, it's a business. They'll say that after a trade or a demotion. It's not as much bitterness as a coping mechanism. It's, I suppose, their way of reconciling being managed like an item of stock when they were previously told they were part of a family. It also explains how quietly some of the exits occur. Sometimes some people leave very dramatically with a lot of fanfare and emotion, but some players, they just disappear. A recent example was with the San Jose Sharks. They publicly emphasized team culture, loyalty, and internal closeness. They're always going on about how close and tight the team are, how there's a really great team culture, and how closely knit they are. And as a fan of the Sharks, I found myself buying into that narrative until recently I learned what happened to one of their players named Nick Leddy. Nick Leddy is a Stanley Cup winner and a veteran of over 1,060 NHL games. In most professions, a 15-year veteran being demoted for the first time would be marked as a significant emotional and institutional moment. However, when it happened recently, it barely registered. If I hadn't heard Sharks GM Mike Greer talking about it, I would have thought that no one in the Sharks organization even cared. Leddy played 19 games for San Jose this season before he was placed on waivers on the 18th of January. This signaled that the organization was saying that it no longer wanted him on the roster and it was willing to let another team assume his contract. When he cleared waivers and no one else wanted him, he was sent to the San Jose Barracuda, the AHL affiliate of the San Jose Sharks, which means that he effectively disappeared from the main club's narrative. There was no public acknowledgement, no collective reflection, no visible response from teammates or media, as far as I can tell. And I found myself asking, well, where's the brotherhood here? Where's the tight-knit closeness of this team? The silence was very illuminating, and it highlighted to me how quickly usefulness overrode loyalty, because the reason Leddy was moved was to clear space for younger players who fit the team's current plan and strategy. It's not malicious. There was no ill will, and Greer was quite regretful and humane in the way he spoke about the process when eventually I did hear someone talking about it. But it made it very clear that the relationship is extremely transactional, no matter how often they talk about it being family and a brotherhood. The other thing that jars and reinforces the manufactured brotherhood is when you see the star players being discussed by the media, particularly in award conversations. For instance, like the Hart Trophy. Praise is often constructed through contrast. So the star is celebrated by diminishing those around him until teammates are framed less as contributors and more as passengers, obstacles, or background context. The language makes it clear that one player is indispensable and great while everyone else is support. A star may simplify the game, draw coverage, and raise the ceiling, but execution still depends on collective labour. So, when that reality is obscured, hierarchy is introduced without ever being named. The bond continues to present itself as collective and equal, even as it begins to function around a clear centre of gravity. So that's where the double bind emerges. On the one hand, players are told that the locker room bond is sacred, more important than any other relationship. At the same time, the culture awards constant comparison. One star player becomes the benchmark. Effort, mistakes, and limitations are no longer evaluated on their own terms, but measured against someone else. Teammates are asked to hold two conflicting truths simultaneously. They must celebrate the star as essential to the team's success, while existing inside a structure that quietly demotes their own standing. Hughes and Celebrini elevate their teams, but the more minutes they take on, this means reduced minutes for others. This pressure must undoubtedly create jealousy or resentment, even if everyone denies this, because ultimately it's structural and a hierarchy has been introduced into a relationship that continues to insist that it is egalitarian. To circle back to something I said before, when I said that players prioritize the locker room above personal relationships, this can be misheard as a denial of love or care. It isn't. Love doesn't erase absence and commitment does not undo missed moments. I'm not saying that people don't care about their loved ones, but during the season, the work means that partners necessarily miss births, funerals, illnesses, and daily life. Acknowledging that doesn't negate sincerity, it's just clarifying the consequence. So when people are asking why hockey players marry despite high rates of infidelity, question kind of misses the structural context. Many relationships are entered into with an unspoken understanding that career comes first, the room comes first, absence is normal, emotional availability is intermittent, and that the rewards justify the trade offs. When the career ends, that hierarchy collapses, the brotherhood fades, the relationship that existed in second place is suddenly expected to absorb everything. So once the locker room is understood as the primary relationship hockey culture asks players to organise their lives around, then many patterns align and you can understand a lot more. It explains post-career emotional struggles, relational breakdowns, and long-standing silences around identity. The belonging felt real to the players because, for a moment in time, it was real. But what most players are rarely prepared for is how conditional that belonging was. I'm not interested in assigning blame or litigating private behaviour. I'm interested in clarity. If hockey continues to tell players that the team bond is the most important relationship in their lives, it probably needs to be honest about what that bond can and cannot sustain. When a relationship prioritised above all is so conditional and fragile, the players probably should be equipped to build durable connections elsewhere. If we continue to act surprised when relationships fracture on the ice or off, people should stop pretending the hierarchy was ever neutral. This ties a little back to my video called Contracts Before Consent, in which I discussed whether or not the young kids who sign their NHL contracts really truly understand what it is they're signing up for. I'm not just talking about the money, the travel, the potential injury. I'm talking about the culture and the life. Was there really truly informed consent when they signed their contract?